Hello and welcome. This is episode number 2. I'm Christine.
I'm Daisy.
In this episode, we do a deep dive into natural wine, and more specifically, how the natural wine movement came about.
We're sort of in the midst of its boom here in the U.S. Coming out of the pandemic in 2023, natural wine sales were about $10 billion and are expected to more than double in 7 years, which means in 2030, it's expected to be over $22 billion.
We'll answer the questions like, isn't all wine natural? It's just fermented grapes, so why all this buzz about them being natural? So we'll break down the various certifications and hopefully provide some insight as to what you want to look for, what to avoid.
This is all sort of related to what consumers expect or what they associate with quality when they purchase wine off the shelf.
Well, spoiler alert, it's not all that cut and dry. But what we do know to be true is it's also a path towards more interesting wines that are ultimately much better for the environment. And better for you? No, we can't say that. So, Judge, please strike that from the record.
When people ask, what is natural wine? One of the most common things that we talk about is that natural wines don't have the additives that commercial or conventional wines have, which begs the question, Christine, why are they adding stuff?
Large wineries, they are tasked with providing wine for national chain retailers, and that's an enormous amount of wine. Just to put that into perspective, the grocery chain Kroger has 2,800 stores across the country. If you assume 1 case per week per store, and that's actually a pretty low turn on a fast-selling or best-selling wine, we're talking about almost 150,000 cases of wine. So it's a lot of wine. And year after year, these retailers expect a certain consistency with those brands. And so with the advancement in all of these food additives and also beverage additives, consistency at a large volume is now possible.
There's been a bit of a shift from the old world mentality that we used to really embrace the nuances of each vintage or each year. So for example, in classic Bordeaux, growing season is essentially summer, as it is in most of the Northern Hemisphere. And in the spring, there's lots of rain. Sometimes that rain will be a longer rainy season carrying into the summer. And moisture is bad for grapes. Not only can you get mildew or rot in the vineyard, but with that longer rain, you get delayed ripening of the grapes. And on the flip side, at the end of summer, when farmers come to harvest their grapes, you get the storms in Bordeaux, sometimes as early as August. So as a farmer, you're playing this game every summer of, do I pick the grapes early August, even though they might not be ready or might not be fully ripe? Or do I wait until the end of August or early September, knowing that a hailstorm or a storm might take out the entire crop? And Christine, you and I have read these stories that in 10 minutes, a hailstorm took out, an entire year's worth of work, and then there's no wine. And so the length of the growing season in Bordeaux is different every year. Therefore, every year, the wines are different, and they reflect the amount of time they had to grow, the amount of water there was for the grapes. And we know the years where all the stars aligned. They had the right growing season, they had the right amount of water, they had the right weather, and those are the 1945s, 1961s. People talk about these vintages.
Certainly. And in that effort, you could really argue that we've kind of lost now the high and the low. We've lost all of the not so good wines, but we've also lost all of the beauty and complexity and real miracle of this alchemy of winemaking that has resulted in these extraordinary vintages. And also, wines really were by nature local. So we're talking about hundreds of years ago. So let's say in your Bordeaux example, everyone was living in Bordeaux and they really had a connection to the weather that year. So if it was a really beautiful, dry, sunny year, they're going to remember that summer. They're going to remember that spring. And so it doesn't take a lot of extra research when they go to the store to buy that bottle. They just have a connection to that vintage. With the global trade of not just wine, I mean, certainly everything, we've lost that connection to certain years and weather patterns. And so I think that it's almost too much information to be able to shop in any sort of
meaningful way.
Meaningful way, exactly.
Now we go to the store and we pick up a bottle off the shelf from the winery we love. And we don't want to hear, this was a year where this wine's not going to taste like what you tasted in the tasting room 5 years ago, or in the restaurant where you discovered this, or if this is the wine you poured at your wedding. We want that bottle of wine every single time we pick it up off the shelf to taste the same. And this is sort of a shift in our preferences over time.
So, how bad is it when we're talking about a conventional wine versus a natural wine? What are these additives and how toxic is this for you?
Good question. So specifically in the US, there are 60 ingredients that winemakers can legally add to their wines, and about 15 to 20 of them are prohibited or illegal for wines in Europe. I think one of the reasons people might not think about this is that the wines here don't have a nutrition facts label. So they're not prompted by a printed list of ingredients.
Right. It's strange that wine doesn't have a back label. Sports drinks, sodas, even water has an ingredient and nutrition back label. But it's actually pretty simple. It's because alcohol is regulated by the TTB and not the FDA. TTB stands for Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. Oh my gosh, that's such a mouthful. And they regulate wine and all alcohol. But since food is regulated by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, they have a different set of standards. And it's frankly more rigorous.
Yeah, they're more stringent. That makes sense. So all these things that they add to wine, we know that they can help stabilize the wines. They can enhance color, flavor, texture. What do you think is the biggest and also the most controversial additive when it comes to wine?
Definitely sulfites. And that's the big demon in wine. What's really interesting about sulfites is they are naturally occurring in wine. They're a natural byproduct of the winemaking process. So when grapes are fermented, the yeast ferments the sugar in the grape juice and it creates CO2, which is carbon dioxide, which creates a carbonation in a sparkling wine if you cap it or trap it. It also creates a small amount of sulfur dioxide, SO2, which is really kind of cool because it's a natural preservative for the wine itself. That helps wines last longer. But there is a difference between naturally occurring sulfites or sulfur dioxide and man-made or synthetic sulfites. It's the chemical or the man-made sulfite compounds that are actually harmful to humans. The naturally occurring sulfites are much easier for us to process.
Oh, this makes total sense to me because this is actually something we've been dealing with at my son's school. Recently, we started a construction project and they found that there's arsenic in the grass in the elementary school.
Oh my gosh.
I know. We had a number of soil experts come in and found out that back in the 50s, when they were building out the school, they used an herbicide, which was legal at the time, around the piping that had arsenic in it. And not surprisingly, families were very concerned and they started testing their children for arsenic. And as it turns out, there are two types of arsenic. The naturally occurring arsenic that comes from the earth, essentially organic arsenic, contains carbon in it, and our bodies can process that. So there's a number of things in our environment. It's in the soil, it's in the air, it's in the water, but things like cashews, almonds, apple seeds all have trace amounts of arsenic, but because it's organic arsenic, our bodies can process and move through it, and it's generally considered non-toxic. And then there's man-made arsenic, which is everything that arsenic gets a bad rap for. It is incredibly harmful. And in the same way, there are natural sulfites, which our body can process more easily than the man-made sulfites that can be added to wines.
Mm-hmm. There are some wines that actually have all sulfites removed. And I think we also have to mention that there are certain conditions where people are allergic even to naturally occurring sulfites. And this is a very serious condition. I mean, they can go into anaphylactic shock from even the organic or naturally occurring sulfites, although this is a relatively uncommon side effect.
Makes sense.
Sulfites are also naturally occurring in other vegetables, in onions, garlic, cabbage, kale, asparagus, leeks, but in very small quantities. People with sensitivities to sulfites generally are not affected by those vegetables or the naturally occurring sulfites. But they are present in a lot of the foods that we typically see on grocery shelves.
Absolutely. It is important to put this all into perspective. Sulfites are used in dried fruits. So if you've ever had raisins, dried apricots, prunes, sulfites are used to prevent mold and bacteria. So in the US, winemakers can legally add up to 350 parts per million to stabilize or preserve their wines. Natural winemakers, if they use any at all, tend to put less than 35 parts per million, so about 10% of that allowable limit. And if they use more than 10 parts per million, they have to disclose on the label this product contains sulfites. So keeping all of this in mind, Dried fruits, again, I mentioned raisins, prunes, apricots, they typically contain 500 to 2,000 parts per million. So the sulfites in wine are considerably less than the amount in dried fruit, and natural wines have even less than that.
Wow, yeah, that's quite a bit more in the food products that are allowed than even in conventional wines.
Really makes you think about your dried fruits.
Yes.
So sulfites are one of the biggest ones. What are some other big additives that are commonly added to wine?
Another common one is called megapurple, and they really phoned in the name of this this chemical here. But megapurple is exactly what it sounds. It essentially turns the wine purple. So this is a very concentrated freeze-dried juice powder that's used, and even when it's used in very small amounts, will turn the wine a dark, rich, garnet red color. And this is really used for the perception of wine, because we think of dark red wines and deep red wines as being more flavorful, more expensive, deeper, and richer. So it's used as a color agent. It's also used as a flavor agent. Because it is concentrated fruit juice, it adds a fruity, punchy kind of intensity and texture without the sugar.
I mean, that fruit is great for covering some of the lesser loved flavors like pyrazines.
It is. So pyrazines are in peppers like a fresh green bell pepper or in jalapeno. It's that very distinct kind of vegetal tanginess. It's actually quite common in a lot of grape varieties, so Cabernet Franc or Carmenere, and it's loved in a lot of the natural wine communities and also just loved as a characteristic of these wines. But I think as our modern perception of wine is very fruit forward, some of these characteristics are less popular. And so the mega purple really helps to, like you said, kind of dampen that pyrazine flavor.
Yeah, and mega purple is one of the ingredients we use here in the US that is illegal to use in wines in Europe.
Yeah, interesting. This is also what will stain your teeth. Very, very a dark purple, thick color. So if you're at a party and you have just a glass of wine and you walk out looking like you just
grill of purple.
Yeah, you've got that grill of wine. It's probably got a fair amount of mega purple in it.
It makes sense.
So what other chemicals or ingredients are banned elsewhere but not in the US?
Another one that's commonly used is called Velcorin. The scientific name of it is dimethyl dicarbonate. And it was legalized late in the 80s. It's used in sodas and fruit juice and sports drinks to essentially sterilize the beverage. The chemical itself is kind of a nasty liquid. So you got to use a hazmat suit and whatnot to handle it. But once it's broken down to use as a food product, then it's a bit safer. It essentially prevents mold and bacteria. And specifically in wine, sometimes there's leftover yeast that's in the bottle. And this specific chemical stops the yeast from a secondary fermentation in the bottle.
So the wine was a living, breathing beverage, essentially, that was still morphing and changing. But this chemical really, I don't know, I mean, it killed it.
It's no longer alive.
Is it dead? Is it dead? Is the wine dead? No, okay, so it's sterilized.
It's sterilized.
But it means it's dead, right?
Yes, but there are less controversial additives when it comes to winemaking.
And some of those are commercial yeast, tannins, even sugar. So commercial yeast are basically freeze-dried yeast that are very predictable. So if you think about the little packets that you buy at the grocery store to make a loaf of bread at home, that's what they're using in commercial wineries. And it's because, again, the yeast is very predictable. It will ferment at a certain temperature. It'll ferment in a certain amount of time. And so this process makes it very easy to make large batches of wine at once. Also, tannins are added. Tannins are naturally occurring in the grape skins and seeds and stems. This is another natural preservative of the grape itself. And we describe tannins as like a tea bag. Basically, tea leaves contain a lot of tannins in the organic matter. And when you leave a tea bag in water too long, it becomes really astringent. And when you take a sip, it'll dry out your gums and your mouth. And that's the tannins at work. And so in order to make a wine feel bigger and taste more powerful and richer, you can add tannins back in. Sugar is another one. Sugar, or the process of chaptalization. So if the grapes are not as ripe at harvest, they can kind of correct that by adding in sugars so that it ferments to the full amount, creating more alcohol and creating a bigger mouthfeel and kind of weight to the wine.
This is kind of an interesting topic, just maybe a whole other episode for us, is the alcohol content in wine and the ability for winemakers to adjust the process to create wines that are higher or lower in alcohol content. And for different reasons, whether they're tax reasons, labeling reasons, there are a number of reasons why adding sugar, certainly, which equals more alcohol, can help them sort of hit that target.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of these natural wines, you'll notice on the label, have dramatically less alcohol. Most of them, not all of them, but will have dramatically less alcohol than some of the more commercially produced wines. And that's simply because the grapes, again, didn't have as much sugar at harvest, and they were fermented as far as those natural living yeasts would take it.
And the purists, right, they don't add anything at all.
Exactly. It's nothing added, nothing taken away.
So, Christine, I mean, natural wines, where did this all start?
So all wines used to be natural before the rise of agrochemicals and food additives. So it was actually in the 1930s when these agrochemicals were widely used and food additives were more common in processed foods. Then in the 50s, some advances were made in toxicology, and people began to start evaluating the safety of these new chemicals in food. 1958 was the first time the Food Additives Amendment required pre-market approval by the FDA. So this is when the FDA got involved for any substance that was intentionally added to food. So in the 50s, this is the first time that we started to see a distinction between something that was fully organic and something that was altered by some sort of chemical or additive.
That's interesting because this is the FDA, not the TTB.
Right. And so they get involved, and this is primarily in the food space and also in agriculture. So then the natural movement, really the backlash to this, kind of all started in the 1970s. So this is the rise of the slow food movement, back to organics. People are reeling against a lot of these new chemicals and techniques in agriculture. Then it wasn't until the 90s that the USDA developed national standards for organic. And then it wasn't actually until 2002 that the USDA implemented the national standards and started using the organic seal, the one that we recognize today.
I think in the US, it was really the 90s that farmers markets really became a thing. Before that, it was all sort of big box for everything. And so that makes sense that people were just more aware of where their food was coming from, where the fruit was coming from.
Right. And the natural food stores started popping up. I remember Mrs. Gooch's, and there were all of these like cute natural food kind of cafes and stands, at least here in LA. But this was happening all over. So it's been over 20 years now that the whole organic and natural movement in farming came about. And in farming, food, and now beverage, but it's still actually quite new. Well, I should reframe that. It's really as old as agrarian civilization, but it's all coming full circle now.
Right. What's old is new again.
Yes. And really the boom has been in the last 10 years. Wine shops are popping up. Every hybrid cafe market concept seems to have a micro selection of hip natural wine labels now. We're really on the brink of a whole natural wine renaissance. And thankfully, there are literally thousands of natural wine producers here in the US and thousands more globally, but they're not the ones on the grocery shelves, at least not right now, not yet in mass. I was a wine buyer in the grocery industry for almost a decade, and natural wine used to be relegated to a tiny selection with the header organic or sulfite free. And at the time, now we're talking early 2000s, it was really just an attempt to appease the health food community that would come through asking for something, that wouldn't give them a headache.
Oh, yeah, I remember this. When organic wines were a thing, they didn't taste very good. They tasted kind of vinegary.
These wines got a horrible reputation because, frankly, they just didn't taste as good. So why was that? Well, during the backlash, they actually just started not using the chemicals to stabilize the wines and then putting those organic wines on the shelf.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not just as simple as not adding stuff to the wine.
Right. It's actually a lot harder to make this type of wine because there are a lot of techniques in old world winemaking that are used to create a natural wine that's not just natural, but also naturally stable. And so these little techniques like microoxygenation and techniques in the vineyard that are used to get the right ripeness or harvesting at the right time so that the grapes interact and ferment a certain way in the winery. All of those techniques had been essentially lost or never learned to a lot of the domestic production. And so organic wine at first was just wine made without the chemicals. But then winemakers from here started going back to France and Italy and Spain and working with some of the great natural winemakers that had been doing this for generations and learning a lot of those techniques, bringing them back, and then started creating some really phenomenal natural wines.
So there was a bit of a setback on the natural wines community. We'll say around 2020 when wine started using terms like clean wines and phrases that suggested that there were health benefits to drinking wine. And there were teams of marketers that even involved celebrities to really bring clean wines to the forefront.
Natural wines felt like a gimmick with really no substance to the term.
Yeah, and so some examples from then were, so Good Clean Wine used the phrase wine that pairs with a healthy lifestyle. Aveline said it's full of natural goodness, free of unnecessary extras. Dry Farm Wines used the tagline, taste pure natural wines. And I think it's worth caveating that many of the wines that were doing this were well made and delicious. In fact, in different ways, they were using natural winemaking practices, but this positioning was really detrimental to the natural wines movement. There are no federal regulations around the use of the word clean when it comes to the wine or the food industries, and I think it was an area that marketers dipped their toe in, but also got their hands slapped at the same time.
So what terms are being used for natural wines?
Good question. I mean, we see this in the grocery store all the time. Organic, biodynamic. I think maybe let's go through them, and we'll start with organic. It really comes down to the grapes and the way the grapes are farmed. And starting with organic, this is the most widely understood because we see it across produce, we see it on coffee, on different products. And it simply means that everything that's gone into the production of this wine, everything that was used to make it, naturally occurs on Earth. So no chemicals, no pesticides, no fertilizers. And there are a number of certifying bodies around the world. Here in the US, it's regulated by the USDA, the EU has done. And the reason it's well understood is also because it's very well tracked. The organic seal is very recognizable. And the USDA has a formal process to recognize products that have gone through the certification in other countries and allowing them to market things as organic here in the US. Another one is biodynamic.
Yeah, so biodynamic wine, it's kind of like the hippie cousin of organic wine, and it's all about growing the grapes in tune with nature. This philosophy is about healing the planet through agriculture, but here's the twist. It involves being in tune with the lunar cycles, cosmic rhythms, and even some kind of quirky practices like burying cow horns filled with manure in the ground to enrich the soil. And so this kind of gets a bad rap a little bit because it feels kind of woo-woo, although I have gone to create these preparations in some biodynamic wineries, a big one here, Frey Vineyards up in Mendocino. It's pretty amazing. And then once you talk to these farmers and you see this in practice in their fields, they will attest to the fact that in 1 year, 2 years, the vineyard itself completely changed. The produce that was coming from it was tastier, full of flavor. There were more organisms growing in the vineyard, and it was actually producing a much better product.
I really like the philosophy of biodynamics, that the earth is this living and breathing organism. And if we're going to farm on earth, we're going to do it in harmony with this heartbeat of the earth. I love it.
That's exactly it. They believe that the land has its own life force and that our job is to nurture it and not add chemicals and to use minimal intervention so that, you know, when you open up that bottle, you're not just drinking it, you're really tasting the vineyard's kind of vibe and life force from the soil up. It's a whole philosophy. So how do you know that a wine is biodynamic? For organic USDA, we now recognize that seal. For biodynamic, it's a Demeter certification. Demeter was founded a long time ago in the 1920s in Europe, and it was following the practices of Rudolf Steiner, and he had these agricultural lectures about biodynamic farming and kind of this way of farming that was in tune with the earth. And a group of farmers concerned about the impact of industrial agriculture formed a cooperative to start to market biodynamic practices. And so that's how it all came about. And Demeter is the organization that certifies internationally now.
There's also a ton of other certifications I see. And I don't know, do you want to get into some of those?
Yeah, and those are interesting too. SIP certified, SIP, which stands for Sustainable in Practice. That's a certification that we give here in the US. Basically, this is about vineyard practices, sustainable winery practices. It encompasses not only your farming, your production, but also your labor force and fair wages. And it's really a holistic approach to sustainability. It's quite rigorous to get the certification, although I will say that there are some allowable practices based on the vintage. And so it takes into consideration that they understand that you don't want to lose your whole crop to maybe a year where there's more mold or
there's no rain.
There's no rain. Exactly. Yeah. So it allows some amount of
intervention.
Exactly. And so similar to in France and in Europe, they have other certifications like this. One commonly recognized is called Lutte Raisonnée, and this is in France. And this is basically made within reason. So it's this same idea that you're trying your best to be sustainable in all ways in practice with the understanding that you need to protect your business.
That makes sense. One of the ones I really enjoyed learning about is when we went to the Raw Festival, which is a collection of natural winemakers around the world. They get together multiple times throughout the year. And we met Derek Trowbridge over at Old World Winery. And we talked a lot about regenerative farming, which has a bit of a pay it forward mentality.
And this is the idea exactly. It's similar to biodynamics. This is the idea that we want to work and live in harmony with the land, and that the land is borrowed for us right now. And really, we want to leave it better than we found it.
A lot of it is about not just protecting the earth and minimizing your footprint on it, whether it's putting nutrients back into the soil, whether it's conserving water. All of it is farming responsibly, but farming with the mindset of making it healthy for future generations.
And so then there are other common terms in the natural winemaking world, like 0-0 or low intervention.
Low intervention, I think, is pretty intuitive, and it's a bit of a hands-off winemaking approach. So rather than injecting yeast into the fermentation, they use a natural yeast and they allow it to ferment sort of at its own pace, at its own temperature. So they're not adjusting the conditions around the wine to make it ferment a certain way. And 0-0 I really like because it sort of flips it around. It's not so much about what you're adding to the wine or not adding, but it also means that nothing's taken out of the wine. So not only are you not stripping it of sulfites, but you're not using processes like fining or filtering that takes stuff out of the wine.
And also the yeast itself will dry and kind of drop out of solution. And so there's often in natural wines sediment, natural sediment.
In conventional winemaking, they use processes to remove sediment out of the wine. One of which is called fining, where they take 2 egg whites and they throw it into the barrel. After fermentation, they mix it into the wine, and the egg whites naturally collect all these particles, and it floats up to the top of the wine with all the particles in there, and they can sort of scoop it out of the wine to make it a little bit clearer. Again, this is all related to what consumers expect or what they associate with quality when they purchase wine off the shelf.
Exactly.
So it's not a marketing gimmick. Natural wines are not just about avoiding certain chemicals. It's really about the way that they're farmed from grape all the way to bottle. And we're here to support those winemakers because farming naturally is really hard.
It is. I mean, these wines are living, breathing beverages and living because the yeast are often still fermenting inside the bottle and breathing because, well, CO2 is a natural product of the fermentation process.
So we're going to close out with a couple of wine factoids. It's something you can take to a party as an icebreaker. I think I went first last time. So Christine, do you want to start with yours?
Sure. Okay, so mine is about the age of grapes. And so, Daisy, how old do you think grapes are? How long do you think they've been on the planet?
Well, our last episode, we talked about the origin of wine, which was Republic of Georgia. And we said it was about 8,000 years old. So assuming grapes are older than that, I don't know, let's say 50,000 years old.
Okay, they're actually quite a bit older than that. Good guess. Grapes are 65 million years old.
Wow. That's like dinosaur era, right?
It is. It is. So to give some context, the dinosaurs were around until about 66 million years ago. So right after the dinosaurs kicked it is when grapes came on the scene.
I wasn't even close.
So grapes are very old. And also to give some context, oranges are about 25 million years old.
Okay.
So that's a pretty familiar fruit for us.
Mm-hmm.
And apples that are well loved and widely farmed now are only 750,000 years old.
Huh.
So
wow.
apples are actually quite recent, which is fascinating. I think about, I don't know, the Bible story, Adam and Eve. Apples feel very old, but grapes certainly do too. They show up in a lot of old texts.
What is the most amount of money anyone has ever paid for a single bottle of wine?
Oh, okay. I'll first answer that question with a question. Is it a sweet wine?
No, it is not a sweet wine.
I would have guessed maybe Chateau Yquem or something. Okay, let's see. Is it a Bordeaux?
No, a good guess. It is another famous region from France. It is from Burgundy.
Okay, so let's see. How about, all right, I'm going to guess that it's potentially a white Burgundy. I know most would guess red.
Yeah, I like this 20 question style. Okay, so no, it's not a white Burgundy, although Chardonnays are very popular. It is a red Burgundy.
Okay.
Do you want the answer?
Yes, I'd love the answer.
Okay.
Now I'm dying to know.
So it's a red Burgundy. It was a 1945 Romanée Conti that sold at an auction for $558,000 in 2018.
Whoa.
And if you're wondering why it was so expensive, the year 1945, there was a lot going on historically, but it was a particularly hot, dry year. So the grapes were very concentrated and it made a very intense and memorable wine. The winemaker only made 600 bottles. And at the time, as you may have already guessed, World War II had just ended, and there was a scarcity of a chemical called carbon disulfide that was used to combat phylloxera, which is a disease that affects wine grapes. It unfortunately took out the next vintage, so they had to rip out all the vines and replant this vineyard after the 1945 vintage.
Oh my God.
They'll never have this wine again. There were 600.
Whoa.
I know. And then just to sort of add to it, the second most expensive bottle also came from this vineyard and from this vintage. So after that bottle was sold at the auction, moments later, a second bottle was sold for $496,000.
Ouch.
Yeah, they got a deal. Smoking deal. And that's it. So that's our episode.
All right. So how do we end these podcasts? This is so awkward.
Cheers.
Cheers. Okay. Cheers. We'll end this one like that.
We'll see you guys next time.
All right. Bye.